a week. So we're open Thursday, Friday, and Saturday from 10 to 3. And so we've shortened our hours a little bit. And then people can kind of stop by then. And then we tried to bolster what we have online, which is, you know, an ongoing process, but
see if we can keep our house quiet between 4 kids and a dog.
I think that they're doing construction next door here, so there might be strange sounds, who knows.
Okay, what did I just do? All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us for another presentation in our Human and Wildlife Interaction speaker series. This time we have Dr. Ken Cannon with Utah State University to talk about bison of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And then next week we'll have Game and Fish here to talk about grizzlies and wolves. And then the week after that is our last one on the domestication of dogs. And this presentation is kind of a precursor to a project the museum is going to be doing throughout September. In Wyoming, September is Archaeology Awareness Month. And so throughout the month, if you are in the area and you have a bison skull that you have found in the basin, you can bring that to the museum. We'll do some measurements and put that into a database, and then we'll get back to you with the results of that little project. So you can stop by Thursday through Saturday, or you can make an appointment, and we'll get that done, and then results will be on our Facebook page as well. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Cannon. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Amy. Let's see, do I need to share my screen, right?
Yeah.
There it is. And okay, how's that?
That's good.
Nobody can see my cheat sheet. Well, I want to thank everybody for showing up, whoever's out there. I know it's this is a little bit awkward. It would have been much more fun to be up in Meeteetse. It's been a long time since I've been there. It's a beautiful part of the world. So if anybody, once COVID goes away and we can all travel safely again, I encourage everyone to take that road if you're going into Yellowstone or in any other part of the area. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit out of the norm for archaeology, at least, and since the last 20 years or so. I think if everybody thinks about archaeology, it's us going out and digging holes with trowels and small little picks and taking stuff back to the museum and measure it and writing reports. But one of the things that's kind of evolved is looking at the archaeological record and how it might expand our view of the prehistoric past, not just with how humans have interacted and lived in the past, but also what the ecosystem looked like, the animals that they hunted, and how that information and that record might be applied to, in this case, wildland management. I first became interested in this topic when I was working in Grand Teton National Park. When we were working on the Jackson Lake project, and we started excavating, and we're starting to find a fair amount of bison. Looking at the literature, bison seem to be showing up pretty frequently, but yet archaeologists were interpreting them as not being a major part of the ecosystem or a major part of the subsistence economy. And then as I started working in Yellowstone, I got more involved with some of the wildlife biologists who were there at the time. Unfortunately, I think a lot of them have since retired, but we still stay in contact. And but what was going on in Yellowstone was people were trying to understand the system, and they were looking at the historic record as well as the prehistoric record to understand the makeup of the species and the mammalian as well as avian ecology of the park, what it was like before it became Yellowstone National Park. And part of that evolved into the wolf reintroduction and writing a chapter for the report to Congress supporting wolf reintroduction. And at that time, they were mostly looking at wolves because some of the arguments were that wolves weren't part of the ecosystem. They had been moved into the area because of European settlement. But based on the archaeological record, we had over almost a 20,000 year record of wolves in the region. But also I was able to accumulate other records as well, including some of the major species such as bison and elk and mule deer. Yellowstone is also a pretty exciting place because there's a tremendous amount of data that's been collected. And on present conditions, past conditions, glaciation, geology. So it's a really good laboratory to start developing models that we can test and use the archaeological record to try and extend that record back further in time, and not just over the last 100 years, 150 years, but much further and deeper into time. And that's important. The National Research Council recently, well, not so recently, but back in the early 2000s, put out plans for public land management. And one of the things that they argued for and said that planning documents should look at the recent geologic past in developing management. So I think, that kind of dovetailed with my dissertation research and continues. And so I just want to kind of continue that and share some of those ideas with you. So for those of you who haven't been to the Yellowstone or the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, it's actually formed by a high arc of high terrain that was formed by what's known as the Yellowstone hotspot, migrating across the Snake River Plain, actually starting in southeastern Oregon over the last 15 million years, and then moving and pushing. I think Ken Pierce likes to call this, this bow wave in front of this movement of uplift. And so it's centered about 630,000 years ago in Yellowstone. And so it causes this high terrain, largely sagebrush, grasses, lodgepole pine, a whole swath of ecosystems within very short linear distances because of the tremendous amount of elevation change. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem, as it's defined now, is about 1.4 million acres region in northwestern Wyoming, northeastern Idaho, and southwestern Montana, as you can see from these maps. It's comprised of 2 national parks, 7 national forests, and public and other public and private lands as well. The idea of the ecosystem was developed in the 1970s and 80s, initially based on the range of the grizzly bear, but more recent definitions have expanded its size and changed the focus from individual species to more general ecological processes. So trying to understand and manage this as a much larger entity and not necessarily focusing on individual species. Today, the GYE represents one of the largest virtually intact temperate ecosystems in the world, with all of its original pre-park mammalian species at present. And as I said before, ongoing research in this area is continuing to provide a wealth of knowledge about the system. So to kind of give a little bit of background about bison, if everybody wants, this is going to be a really short, condensed version of it. So any biologist or anybody out there, don't nitpick at me too much. So it's a fairly complex history. Bison belong to the family Bovidae, which also includes antelopes, cattle, gazelles, goats, and sheep. Their characteristics are 4-chambered ruminating stomachs, at least 1 pair of horns. They typically inhabit grasslands, but they can be wooded as well. And paleontological record traces family members back to about 22 million years ago, during the late Oligocene and early Miocene. This little picture of the Egotragus is what paleontologists think was probably the common ancestor of bison some 22 million years ago. And you can also see that squirrely little tree of life diagram of the taxonomy of them. So bison and cattle, their common ancestor probably split off about 3.3 million years ago. So North American bison, at one time, there were 5 species of bison recognized in North America. During the Pleistocene, or the Ice Age, between around 240 and 220,000 years ago, bison priscus, or the steppe bison, migrated from Siberia to Alaska. This species inhabited parts of North America throughout the remainder of the Pleistocene. In the mid-continent of North America, bison latifrons, the real long horned one, you can see on the left there next to that person scale, was replaced by some priscus in the mid-continent, and it died out around 20,000 years ago. There's a number of bison latifront specimens to the west of Yellowstone on the Snake River Plain. And there's a beautiful specimen that's in the Idaho State Museum in Pocatello. It's truly a massive animal. In contrast, bison antiquus, which you can see next to latifrons, became increasingly abundant in parts of the mid-continental North America from about 18,000 years ago to around 10,000 years ago, after which the species appears to have given rise to the living species of bison. Bison antiquus is one of the most commonly recovered large mammal herbivores that are found at the La Brea tar pits. They've also shown up at bison kill sites, such as the Horner site near Cody, which is just not too far away from the museum. And the modern bison that we see today is the result of a long period of this evolution. Around 1800 years ago, around 1800, the bison were probably at its maximum extent of its historic range, as you can see by this map. It extended from northern Canada south into Mexico and as far east as central Pennsylvania. Estimated numbers suggest that there were maybe as many as 30 million bison at this time when they were at this historic range. And as we all probably know, bison was a major economic aspect of Native Americans, particularly Native American Plains Indians. We have all these wonderful romantic visions of bison hunts, but it was a major part of their subsistence economy for thousands of years. 1,000-pound bison could yield about 420 pounds of meat, not to mention its hide to use for clothing and also to make shelter. Bones were used for tools. And you can see from that one historic photograph in the lower right-hand side or left-hand side, you can see Plains Indians are drying bison meat there on those bison racks. So that was, they dry the meat and that would take them into the winter. The bison enormous range was drastically cut and changed when Euro-American settlers started expanding into the West. Between about 1867 and 1883, the Transcontinental Railroad split what was known as the northern and southern herds in half. And by 1883, we think the population of bison, due to overhunting, exploitation, fur trapping, fur hunting, a number of different ways that bison were being used, their populations dwindled to as many as 1,000 individuals. And it had not been for the interest of a number of citizens who raised bison in captivity and on small ranches, the bison probably would have been extinct. In Yellowstone, I think at the turn of the last century, there was probably like 19 individuals in the park. So there are currently 17 federal bison herds that range west of the Mississippi River, with most of these found within their historic range. But you can see from this map, all those dots represent herds, both private and public, that stretch throughout the United States and into Canada and Mexico. So the Yellowstone bison herd, as I said earlier, is one of the few free-ranging herds in North America, rescued from near extinction in the late 19th century by a combination of aggressive protection of the native herd and the introduction of bison from private herds. During the early part of the 20th century, the two herds that both the introduced and the native herds were managed separately, but eventually they were allowed to interbreed. And then over the course of the next 50 years, bison were intensively managed. And you can see by this chart, you can see the gray triangles represent bison numbers, and the the red squares represent removals of bison. So you can see how many bison were culled or removed from the park over that course of that 100 years. In the 1960s, the National Park Service made a dramatic shift in policy, largely in response to what's known as the Leopold Report. It began to take on a non-interventionist approach to natural resource management, relying instead on natural processes to affect change and to control wildlife population numbers. Bison responded positively, ranging from 397 in 1967 to a high of well over 5,000 today. And the prehistoric record that we have in Yellowstone dates back at least 10,000 years. Although it is fragmentary, it does provide a record of landscape use from low elevation grasslands to alpine meadows. The archaeological record of humans and bison has long been of an interest in Yellowstone. For example, the second superintendent of Yellowstone, who's depicted here, Norris, was recorded numerous rock alignments and what he described as bison traps in Paradise Valley in northern Yellowstone. In 1932, Barnum Brown of the Natural History Museum, and commonly known as Mr. Bones, who was also the discoverer of T-Rex, conducted excavations at the Emigrant Bison Drives just to the north of Yellowstone. Later in the 1960s, George Arthur, late of the University of Regina, recorded numerous bison drives on the glaciated basalt benches of Paradise Valley. In the late 1970s and 1980s, Gary Wright and his students from the SUNY State University of New York at Albany conducted extensive surveys and testing of archaeological sites in Yellowstone and Jackson Hole in an effort to understand the pre-contact settlement and economy of the region. He argued that bison were always relatively rare in northwestern Wyoming and that they would have been too unpredictable in numbers to provide a stable food source. Since populations were small, one successful kill of adults would have reduced the reproductive potential of the herd to a level where it no longer would have been a significant part of the ecosystem. And I started really scratching my head about that when I first started working in Yellowstone, or in Grand Teton and Yellowstone, because we were working kind of in the shadow of Gary Wright. He was the one who did this extensive work. But when I looked at his record, it was like, well, every time he found bone, it seemed like it was bison. So I couldn't understand how he was making this argument. But one thing I was wondering is bison numbers during the 70s and into the early 80s were relatively low, and bison were typically not as visible in a landscape as they are today. So that management of bison may have somewhat skewed his vision of how many bison might have been on the landscape. Mary Marr, who was a longtime wildlife biologist, had a very different view. She argued that substantial numbers of bison inhabited the Yellowstone Plateau at all seasons and long before the killing of the northern herd of Great Plains bison in the early 1880s. This debate continues and includes recent opinion articles that question management practices of large ungulates in Yellowstone and the lack of evidence to support the current number of bison in the park. Recently, there's been a couple articles that have been two articles, one opinion article that has shown up in recent issues of Rangelands magazine, and they both authors, all three authors, extensively used the archaeological record to make their argument. In my opinion, I think they were misusing the archaeological record. The authors in both articles clearly have a misunderstanding of our current knowledge of the archaeological record, specifically how the record comes to be visible to archaeologists, and the myriad factors that influence our understanding of the record, not only from a natural context, but from a research context as well. And so I think the next part of this presentation is going to talk specifically about how we understand the archaeological record and what the archaeological record represents, and how and how we can interpret that and then use that further to understand bison populations in the past and maybe even how we manage bison populations in the future. This is an article that rebuttal article that I had to both of them. Of course, I had to do it. And it's in press right now and should be coming out in the latest issue of Rangelands magazine or journal. So let's take a look at the archaeological record. Over the course of the ensuing decades, archaeological research in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem has continued. The work has been a result of legislatively mandated projects such as major infrastructure projects, but there's also been significant research efforts such as the work by Larry Todd's Graybull River Sustainability Landscape Ecology Project, or GRISLY, Craig Lee and his associates, ice patch work, and Doug McDonald's work in northern Yellowstone. In the Wyoming portion of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, over 10,000 sites have been recorded, although very few have been excavated. Of the few sites that have been excavated, even fewer have preserved bone or other organic materials. At least 158 sites have been recorded as having bison remains, with 43 directly dated contexts that span the Holocene. And you can see it by that bar chart that shows the directly dated archaeological sites that contain bison remains. And then a map of the Wyoming portion of Yellowstone ecosystem and sites that have been recorded, and also those sites that have bison remains. Sites range from logistically sophisticated large drive complexes north of Yellowstone to high altitude remains ranging from melting ice patches and alpine glaciers. Some important sites that have contained bison in the region include the Horner site, which is just downstream from Cody. It was originally discovered by Cody native James Allen. Excavations were conducted between 1949 and 1952 by Glenn Jepson at Princeton's Museum of Natural History, and later Waldo Wadle of the Smithsonian Institution. More recently, in 1977 and 1978, George Frizen of the University of Wyoming returned to Horner, reopening the Princeton Smithsonian bone bed, but also uncovered a second component that was nearly 1,000 years older. This older component was buried under nearly 2 meters of sediment and well preserved. That work also contributed to Larry Todd's dissertation and a number of other research papers over the years. The assemblage consists of a minimum of 65 bison that were killed in the late fall or early winter. 2 radiocarbon ages date the kill between 9,677 and 9,238 years BC. Some of the ice patches that are melting in the area also have preserved evidence of bison. These at the moment look like natural deaths, and not necessarily the hunt of the effect of human hunting. But again, it just shows the range of bison in the ecosystem, and also provides us with more evidence of the dates of those bison as well too. Rebecca Seguros and Dave Volchek lended me these photographs of some of those remains. The Snake River Delta and Grand Teton National Park also had extensive remains of bison that were recovered between 1986 and 1988 as the Midwest Archaeological Center excavated a number of sites along the Snake River Delta and the lakeshore as the lake was brought down to its original elevation while they were reconstructing and repairing Jackson Dam. At least 39 individuals recovered that range in age from 700 years ago to 1,300 years ago. So in analyzed large faunal assemblages, bison are prevalent, and you can see by some of these pie charts of some of the sites around in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Bison hunting, with the exception of bison drives in Paradise Valley, I would argue are the result of more encounter type hunting by small bands of hunters. But again, bison appear to be a persistent prey species in the system. So many, so getting back to my rebuttal of the rangeland articles and trying to understand the archaeological record more is that many environmental factors affect preservation of faunal remains and other organic remains at archaeological sites. When we look at sites with preserved bone, they tend to be in soils with moderately acidic to neutral pH, which are substantially limited on the Yellowstone Plateau. Excuse me. And I'm kind of jumping back and forth a little bit between the Yellowstone Plateau and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, largely because some of the better data that we have is from the Yellowstone Plateau, specifically the soils data. So it acts better as a better understanding of what we're seeing out there. Another important taphonomic issue in forested areas, which the Yellowstone Plateau is largely forested, is tree tip out. Repeated tip outs, which is when wind blows, trees are knocked down, the roots are exposed, and it tends to churn up the soils. So these repeated tip outs, which are fairly common with shallow roots, rooted trees such as lodgepole pine, they keep the archaeological record and fossil materials up in the biomantle, so close to the surface, where they are continued to be biodegraded, as opposed to allowing them to be covered in sediments and incrementally buried where they have a better chance of preservation. Another factor also related to tree cover is forest fire. When an area is burned and a duff consumed, there is typically an extensive faunal assemblage that is present for the first year after a fire. This freshly burned bone, as you can see, is highly weathered, and once the duff is burned, unprotected and quickly disintegrated. Larry Todd's done extensive work, part of his Grizzly project, documenting these burned over areas and kindly allowed me to show some of these photographs. In Yellowstone National Park alone, 771 sites have been subjected to recent fires. So fires is an important part of the ecosystem there, but it also has a significant impact on preservation. A final factor to consider is glaciation. Extensive glaciation of the Yellowstone Plateau and the surrounding high country scoured the landscape. And this is a map showing the latest glacial extent about 18,000 years ago, based on research by Ken Pierce. The combination of till with its tight, compact nature, along with tree cover, has produced little sediment yield from these slopes and thus little sediment flux in the fluvial and slope systems. Areas of glacier scoured bedrock add to this low sediment flux issue. In the northern Yellowstone region, there are essentially no foot slopes deposits and not much in the way of Holocene age fans, which typically preserve long records. This is in contrast to southern Yellowstone, the southern portion of the Yellowstone ecosystem in southern Jackson Hole, where lusk accumulated on slopes after the Pinedale retreat, compared to the northern area where glaciers scoured the lusk off the landscape. And it's in this southern area that we have good rework deposits that have provided deeply buried soils with good faunal preservation. So these stratigraphic profiles are from sites in southern Yellowstone. The Game Creek site, which is along the Snake River south of Jackson, and the Crescent H Ranch, which is at the lower right, which is a deeply buried site along Wilson Road, Fall Creek Road in Wilson. Lots of deposition of lusk there. We had faunal remains that we dated down over 18,000 years old. And then also other sites that are somewhat particular and specific in their geologic context. The Stinking Springs Rock Shelter, which also produced fairly deeply buried deposits. Sites on these things tend to preserve, have deeply buried preservation and tend to preserve faunal and other organic remains. So that is kind of looking at one of the reasons why we don't have this robust archaeological record. And one of the reasons that researchers have argued that bison have not been a particularly prevalent part of the ecosystem is because they've looked at it, and they've looked at it in a very simplistic way as either presence or absence. And by looking in more detail about the system that preserves and has affected preservation in this ecosystem, I think we can better understand what's going on and why we don't have as much a preserved bone as we would like. It also helps us to understand where we might want to dig for archaeological sites that would retain those long-term records. So another part of my argument to how we can apply bison and other wildlife species from the archaeological record to wildlife management is based on isotopic studies. These are well known in the literature and is well applied in a number of different disciplines to understand ecology, also changes in systems, ecosystems, as well as migration of animals. Carbon isotope is important because it can tell us the types of plants that bison in particular are eating based on their evolution and also their well, mostly on their evolution. There's two different species or two different systems of represented in in plants, and it's both based on their photosynthetic pathways. One is known as the C3 plants, which are cool season plants, and they represent about 90% of all plants and trees in temperate and cooler climates. C4 plants evolved during a period of Earth's history when it was much drier and warmer, so they tend to are relatively warm season plants. They also include warm weather plants as well as tropical plants. And they tend to be more competitive to C3 plants under periods of stress. So what we can do with isotopes is look at the isotopic signature and understand which one of these plants bison might have been consuming during their lifetime. And another isotope we've looked at is oxygen isotope. And I know this seems a little bit complex, but essentially what it's showing is isotopes as they move from the West Coast to the east, they become lighter, isotopically lighter, as they move and precipitate over mountains and then move inland. And these isotopes are also preserved in teeth of bison, and we can look at those signatures. So because bison are obligate drinking herbivores, they display stable isotope values that closely correlate with local water values. For example, bison drinking from wetlands and lakes that experience evaporation will be isotopically enriched, so they would have higher numbers. While bison drinking exclusively from streams and rivers filled by snow runoff should reflect less seasonal variability with signatures that are isotopically depleted. So we can use this information to see how these bison are moving, where they are on the landscape. Are they migrating up and down the mountains, between the mountains and basins over the course of their lifetime? Oxygen isotope is also is a good indicator of temperature. So we can calculate temperature, prehistoric temperature from the isotopic signature, and that can be used against some of the models of climate change. So what I've been doing and did for my dissertation was sampling down tooth of bison. So I don't know if it shows up here by arrow. So we can take samples. You can see all these samples from these teeth, and essentially what we're looking at is the life of the bison. So each one of these two samples we subjected to analysis at the University of Georgia and also at the University of Kansas and University of Arizona to look at what these bison were doing over the course of their lifetime. Obviously, if we have younger bison, we have a much longer record because the bison's teeth aren't as worn down. But this kind of shows you one example of a fairly young individual. And this is kind of the record that we look at. So we can see this is increasing age along the bottom, and we can see how the bison are moving through the ecosystem and what is being preserved. So we have summer enriched waters and then winter depleted waters as they're migrating across the landscape. We also looked at a number of three individuals that were aged at 2.6, 3.6, and 4.6 years. So they represented three different birth cohorts from the Horner site to see if we could understand a little bit better about what a herd was doing. Because this was a mass kill. They were probably all part of a nursery herd. And these individuals in their different life stages might tell us a little bit about that herd structure and how that herd might have been migrating across the landscape. And what we saw is that the carbon samples, the carbon isotope samples, illustrated relatively limited variability in their diet. They tended to be relied more on warm season seafloor vegetation, which have been more prevalent in the basins, in the Oregon Basin, and then would have been on the Yellowstone Plateau. And that is consistent with Kathy Whitlock's paleoenvironmental model. The oxygen also suggests greater variability in the landscape from year to year. And again, that's probably from rainfall, evaporation, and over this period of time that these animals were alive. One of the interesting things too is that the strontium values indicate that the bison were largely restricted to the sedimentary rocks of the Bighorn Basin and Oregon Basin area. You can see that lower line shows the signature of the Yellowstone volcanics. They're very distinct. So in my argument, in my opinion, it looks like these bison were not traveling between the mountains and basins over the course of their life. They had a much more restricted range that didn't include the uplands. And this, I'm just going to go through these things real quickly since our data isn't really great on it. But we have Bill Eckerly constructed this annual temperature and precipitation model for Jackson, Wyoming, based on current records and paleoenvironmental records to show how both precipitation and temperature changed over the last 10,000 years. And one of the things I was trying to plot was looking at C3 vegetation and see from some archaeological specimens from the Game Creek site. And there's not a really great correlation, but I think part of the issue is the Game Creek site's C4 or delta carbon signatures are based on radiocarbon dates, which tend to be not recorded or not analyzed specifically for the carbon, but tend to be more generalized for calibrating the radiocarbon dates. So I think that might be one of the issues with this data. Hopefully, with some funding that we're looking into, we're going to start looking at all the Game Creek bison, so we have a better record of bison in Jackson Hole. And again, this is looking at temperature, precipitation again, looking at the oxygen isotopes, and we do show some correlation during periods of cooler temperature, or warmer temperature rather, in some of the bison based on the oxygen isotopes. But again, samples are small, hoping to do more work with them. Strontium isotopes, which I ran through briefly when looking at the Horner site, is really intriguing and exciting because strontium isotopic signatures represent a signature from the geology that that these bison are living on. The plants also have this same signature. So as bison are consuming the vegetation, they're incorporating the strontium signature into their bones and into their teeth. So we can look at the strontium signatures in those individuals. And again, what I did was they're all based on this down through sampling. And what's also interesting about strontium is it is related to age. So as the strontium isotopes are decaying, their signatures are getting higher. So the lower the number your strontium signature is, the younger the rocks are. The older, the larger the number, the older the rocks are. So in Yellowstone National Park, you can see the numbers are really low, and that's because they're relatively recent volcanic deposits up there on the Yellowstone Plateau. When we look at Jackson Hole and also the Horner site material, we have a much higher strontium signature, which suggests that these are from older rocks and would be the sedimentary rocks that we see in Jackson Hole and also over in the basin by the Horner site. Now, even though these are really small samples, I'm really excited about them because I think they're really compelling and showing that there is not a lot of migration, at least from these samples, of bison between these mountains and basin areas. And that was one of the models I was trying to test as part of my dissertation. Do we see large-scale bison migration over the course of the seasons? And this data suggests that bison had fairly small ranges and didn't have these large seasonal migration patterns. So what does that have implications for as we start thinking about bison management? And bison are set specifically only allowed to live on public lands in Yellowstone and Jackson Hole. Once they leave, they are culled. So I think that's one of the questions I'm grappling with right now is were bison always had these small ranges? Did these ranges prevent them from interbreeding? Is there a genetic component to this? That's another issue to deal with. And also, if they had these smaller, more predictable ranges, it made the animals more predictive for Native American hunting. So it's to me, it's pretty exciting and compelling what this data is telling us, especially if we have everybody, I think, has these images of plains bison migrating hundreds and hundreds of miles seasonally from the northern plains to the southern plains, which probably didn't occur. And now, looking at some of the bison in the mountains, they had much smaller ranges too. But this is obviously to be continued. So to kind of wind up here, I know it's a lot to throw at everybody. The bison record in Yellowstone National Park and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem extends back probably 12,000 years and supports the notion that bison have been an integral part of the ecology and economy of the region for the length of the Holocene, as soon as glaciers left the region. However, it is an environment that is challenging for the preservation of fallen remains, particularly on the Yellowstone Plateau, where soils tend to be acidic, shallow, and subject to frequent bioturbation, although there are unique areas that have preserved faunal materials. It's important to understand these processes that contribute to the archaeological record and how it is in turn interpreted. It is not simply a matter of presence and absence. It is also important to know that the record provides more than just information on the presence or absence of species, but can contribute directly to the resolution of various conservation issues, such as it can reveal pre-contact herb demographic structure. Each one of those large bison kills, like the Horner site, are are trapped moments in time. So we can look exactly at that bison herd, what that age structure was like at 9,200 years ago. How does that compare to bison today? Are we managing bison the same way? Are we managing bison in thoughtful ways for perpetuity of the species in the long term? We can identify the distribution of pre-contact populations, where they were on the landscape, and the time periods, the climatic periods that they were there. We can provide information on the ecology of those bison. Remember, we're looking at individual records of these bison when we look at a tooth. So we're essentially, have this diary of these individual bison. And that can tell us a lot about how they were using the landscape. And it also provides proxy data for what the environment was like, not only what the temperature was like, but also what particular plants were available to them at any particular time in the past. And it also provides a temporal scale and an evolutionary scale for the conservation of modern populations. I don't think this has been explored well enough, but I think we need to look more carefully at the pre-contact bison populations and their genetic makeup to see if there are differences, and if we are seeing these populations that are more or less isolated, is there a genetic component to that? And then this is a little bit more editorializing, I apologize for, but in 2000 I got to host the Department of Interior's Bison Management Group, and I was presented with a rebuff by Dr. Mark Boyce, who's a longtime biologist in Yellowstone ecosystem and other places in North America, and he told me he thought the archaeological record was interesting. But it was largely an intellectual exercise, in his words. It was like counting angels on the head of a pin. So I kind of put a bison on the end of that pin. I found this and still find this an important challenge to archaeologists. How do we illustrate that the archaeological is relevant to wildlife management issues? This is one of the reasons that I continue to try and get this message out, and it's not just me. There's a number of archaeologists out there working on these issues as well, not just with bison, but with other species. I think we do have a record that is important, and hopefully it'll be applied greater to some of these issues. So I thank you for your patience. Hope people are still awake. You can, I guess, ask questions.
Yeah, we've got quite a few. The first one is from Facebook, and it's, did bison populations reach their zenith about 1800 because Native American population fell drastically?
No, they probably reached their greatest population size and distribution for a number of factors. It probably didn't have to do necessarily with Native American decline. It probably had to do with, we were coming out of the Little Ice Age, so times were wetter, cooler. It allowed biomass to expand. So bison started moving further east, and yeah, it just allowed those populations to increase. So I think it was probably more or less related to environmental conditions being much more compatible to bison.
So do there seem to be more encounter or small group kills in the archaeological record, or targeted herd killing like a bison jump?
Well, it depends on where you are. In the Emigrant Valley North, there's these huge miles and miles worth of drive lines. So it has to, I think a lot of it has to do with topographic conditions, where those animals can be herded to either be jumped off of cliffs. There's a number of places that use arroyos to drive bison into dead heads of arroyos. So it all depends on where you are on the landscape. I think when you get up in the mountains, you weren't having those large nursery herds, and so I think places like Bugis Holding up in Sunlight Basin, around Jackson Hole, and around Jackson Lake, we probably had smaller bison populations, and they were and also smaller groups of people that were hunting them, so they were probably focusing just on that encounter type of hunting, as opposed to when you can get a large contingent of people coming together in the fall for a number of reasons that allow that for a more logistically complex hunting process to occur, because you need lots of people, not only to get the bison moving in the right direction, but then once you get all these bison either in a trap or off a cliff, you have to process those bison. So it's a much more a larger and more intense effort for processing and logistics. So I think it just has to do with the particular situations of where you are on the landscape and what time of year you're there.
And then, is there an archaeological record of diseases in bison like brucellosis?
No, it doesn't seem like that is preserved, and since brucellosis is an abortive side, it doesn't show up or preserve in bones. There's probably records of genetic inbreeding in bison. So sites that Dr. Frizen has worked on, there seems to have been teeth anomalies that might be related to inbreeding of small populations, but I'm not sure of any evidence of diseases that are preserved in the record.
And then you mentioned that it's possible that these bison herds were staying like in the basin rather than going up to the high country and not migrating these big distances that people often think of them migrating. Is that a good sign for Native American tribes that are getting herds back?
I think so, but because every place people want to put bison have been there in the past. And bison today, when they're on ranches, they tend to be more like cattle. So I think, we can use that argument if Native Americans want to use the archaeological record and say, our ancestors lived here, we had this bison. Yeah, the archaeological record can certainly provide another set of evidence to support their argument for having bison and herding bison. But I'm not quite sure how it might affect how they manage them, because most, like I said, most bison that are on ranches today are treated like cattle, and they're not allowed to be bison.
Great. I think if anybody has any last minute questions, I think that's all. I guess one last question would be, what is your absolute favorite thing about the research that you've done?
Well, being outside, collecting the data outside, seeing wonderful places like Yellowstone, getting to know a lot of the people. I think, one of the fun parts of the work I've done is it's been collaborative. So over the years, I've worked with a lot of really great people, met a lot of great people, and some of those friendships have survived a long time. So it's a lot of different things. It's going out, collecting that data, coming back and thinking about it. Archaeology is fun because we can, we go out and we get in the field and walk around and have fun out in the field, but we also get to come back and sit in a lab and think about it as well. So it's got, kind of the best of both worlds. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here. And we will try and link that article that you have coming out in Rangelands when it comes out.
Okay, great. Well, thank you.
Thanks.